Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and welcome back to my continuing interview series of CSM candidates. If you're listening to this just after the video has come out, then you should know that on Monday the voting for the next Council of Stellar Management will start, and this election will determine who is on the player representative body, which actually flies out to Iceland and meets with CCP in person in order to help give feedback from the player base to CCP directly, and also work under an NDA in order to allow CCP to better develop new features. I personally have spent 3 years on the council, and now that I'm coming off of my final term, I'm taking the time to interview candidates who I think have a decent chance of being elected into CSM 14. But that's enough about the election and myself. Let's let the candidate of the day introduce themselves.
So my name is Kaneland, and I fly currently with Tuskers. So I live out of a wormhole, and we do a lot of small game PvP. Um, kind of got started originally in faction warfare as a solo career, but mainly when I first started, I started in nullsec for a couple of years, got bored, burnt out of CTAs, things like that. Went to faction warfare for about 3 or 4 years. Faction warfare started to die out, and so then I moved to wormholes with Tuskers, and now I'm experiencing a slightly different side of the game through small gang PvP. When I was originally mainly pure solo, and so that gives me kind of a large experience through all the different areas of space. Because not only did I do low sec faction warfare, I also did low sec non faction warfare. So I got to experience the areas of low sec that, had a lot smaller groups in them and weren't part of any kind of militia. Um, so the reason why I want to run for the CSM now is just so we can have a candidate who kind of understands a lot of different aspects of space, can provide input through those areas of space that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of or might overlook, as well as a lot of people know me for like my torpedo videos or my solo PvP videos. I spend a lot of time on ship balance and fitting and how I want to get the most out of a particular fit that I'm trying to do that is outside the meta. So like a lot of weaker ships or ships that people feel are weaker, I have probably a slightly better understanding of their strengths and weaknesses and how they could be improved. So I think that would be beneficial to being on the CSM, especially in regards to things like ship balance and module balance, because I can just put a lot more input or time, even like researching things or even providing examples to help, either CCP or other members of the CSM understand what, may or may not happen if changes go through.
So one of the first sessions that the CSM will typically have at a summit is a meeting with the upper leadership of EVE Online's development team. And typically during this meeting, the CSM as a whole has tried to present a small list of 3 to 4 points during this meeting. What is a point that you feel that you could convince the rest of the CSM deserves to be presented during this meeting?
Well, the first thing, so it's kind of a difficult question that would probably need a little bit more time to think on, but from my perspective, and again, I think this would be difficult to get everyone on the CSM on board just because of the split in what would you call it, demographics, because it's inherently it's going to be a larger nullsec population in the CSM. But from my perspective, and I think what would be good for the game as a outlet for newer players is to get faction warfare reiterated on, or at least fix some of the big sores on what's causing the stagnation in there, because it's a good area for new players to get into to actually experience PvP instead of just being fed straight into the new bro corps and the big block alliances. But to answer your question more clearly, because again, the faction warfare example, it's still a good example, but as far as getting everyone on board with it, and especially if it's not already on CCP's roadmap, I think the one thing that would be a good discussion point between nullsec members and everyone would probably be sinos. I think that would be something that would be interesting to discuss and try to improve upon without necessarily nerfing them.
What do you see as the problems with sinos right now?
The main problem is that there's very little counterplay available to an instant module that allows basically anything to come through within seconds. So, like, we do have cyno inhibitors, which CCP iterated on, which is, very nice, but it's still a 1 minute, spool up time. Whereas if anyone's paying attention, they can just click a button, even if the inhibitor goes up during that time, and they hit the cyno within that 1 minute window, the cyno is still going to be active the entire time. So things can still jump in. So the inhibitor really has no purpose at that point. It's just wasted. And on top of that, let's say you put an inhibitor down on a supercarrier. All the inhibitors EHP is in structure. So you don't have any way to effectively rep it to prevent the super from blowing it up and then just, sinoing and more stuff to, save itself. So it's still useful, don't get me wrong. It's just it's not balanced properly to be suitable in the current meta. The other issue is, with capital proliferation, everyone has a bait ship now that has a Sino on it. So it'd be nice if there could be more counterplay, such as either a new module that's introduced to provide Sino inhibition the same way that the Sino module itself works, so basically instant, or making a new ship or a new ship or a new module specific to a ship. My oldest example that I've had for years is giving Marauders either a new module that functions separately from Bastion that would provide a Sino inhibition, or incorporate it into Bastion itself. But I think there's a lot of room here to either modify the Sino module itself, such as giving it a spool up, which I believe Suetonia has mentioned before, or creating new modules to counteract the Sino better, or even just fix some of the mechanics. For example, like when an inhibitor goes up, it actually shuts down the Sino, so it can't just stay active the entire time the inhib is up.
So one of the ways that CCP has tried to get feedback on what individual CSM members perceive as problems within the game is asking them to present 3 different things that they perceive as problem mechanics or problem areas that CCP would gain a lot out of working on. What are the first 3 mechanics that come to mind for you as areas of the game that CCP would gain from iterating on?
Well, for the first example I gave with faction warfare, as things to improve is, again, it goes back to player retention. So going back a little bit, like I mentioned, I started out in nullsec. So I did the whole nullsec thing for 2 or 3 years. I joined a corp. I did the whole corp experience. I had a good time. I made friends. But then those guys who I played with started to not play anymore. They, real life issues or whatever, they dropped off. And I was pretty much in a dead corp and nullsec at the time. So I was getting kind of burnt out from CTAs and just, not really having anyone to interact with, and Eve started to become boring. So instead of me saying I'm going to quit Eve, I decided to say let's go somewhere else and experience another part of Eve. And at that time, about 4 years ago, it was faction warfare was still very healthy. So I immediately went to faction warfare. I just joined the NPC Corp, and I started doing my own solo thing because I had a pretty good foundation on ships and things like that, living in nullsec for a while. And so I went to faction warfare and really started to dig into the details on the ships. What are their strengths and their weaknesses? What counters what? Things like that. And that helped me stay within Eve and enjoy it. And I think if in its current state, faction warfare, it still does, I'm sure, attract people. But once they get there, it's not very, you used to be able to go into faction warfare, spend 5 minutes and find a fight. Now it's a lot harder to do that because you're always just running into bots or, faction warfare plexers, and no one wants to fight. Or when they do fight, it's just, the normal residents who aren't even part of faction warfare, pirates, I guess you could say, that just want to come in and blob you or hide in the plex and cloak ships. And I'd like to see that kind of get iterated on so that when new players actually do want to go in PvP, they have a proper outlet for it instead of just being forced into the new bro corps and nullsec, or having a unbalanced time in faction warfare, or a non-fun or whatever you want to call it, where it's just not as optimized as it used to be.
Okay, so that's the first thing. What are the other 2 things that come to mind?
So the other things, as far as main main issues that we'd like to sort out, or that I'd like to sort out, again, I mentioned Sinos already. That'd be the second talking point to benefit the game, just because it's
I think you've
not
gone over
the
that one enough. You don't need to
yeah
retread that ground, don't
yeah.
worry.
So the third one would be ship and module balance. So, for example, the an easy example anyway would be like Navy battleships, or Navy, even some Navy cruisers are not very good at the moment. And that kind of also ties back into faction warfare, because those players rely on those ships to sell P to make money. So it kind of goes full circle. On top of that, there's a lot of modules that could use some rebalancing for like Cosmos missions, or the storyline items, because they're actually really good items. They're just competing for faction items. So no one's really going to want to spend, for example, 60 million on a interruptive point when you can just get a Caldari Navy point for the same price. The only difference between the two is that the interruptive is like 2 CPU less. So I think they're excellent fitting options. They're just not balanced properly, or they're not as available as I would expect them to be. Now, how that would improve things is, in theory, the Cosmos items would drop in price, because you would introduce more materials to make them more available. I think there's already lots of BPCs out there. They just need materials. So that would also help newer players have access to modules that'll help make fittings easier, but not have to make them spend, quadruple the cost of the ship they're putting it on. Which again opens up the game a little bit more for newer players, so they're not having to wait to get fitting skills, which, fitting skills are great. It's just they're boring to train. So again, it kind of,
You've gone very in depth here on like one specific change. And what I'd be more interested in finding out is, generally how fast would you like balance to be? You've highlighted some specific balance changes, but how would you like CTB to balance overall? Would you prefer them to do shorter bursts of like more consistent balance iteration? Would you rather they do, this the kind of 6 month schedule that they currently have, just go deeper on what they balance? What are the problems with the way CCB balances right now, and how would you change them?
I think in the current balancing, or the way the patches are laid out, I think is good, but there's not a lot of iteration on them. So I would like to see balancing done either on a month or bi-monthly basis, at least on things for that are small, kind of the low-hanging fruit type of deals, or even just number changes. I'm not expecting them to have citadels rebalance completely in 2 months, but just little things I think would go a long way within the community to see that yes, they are aware that certain things may be out of whack, or maybe just to mix up the meta, just throw something out there to see how it settles. For bigger things like, major citadel changes or major mechanic changes, I don't mind waiting 6 months, a year for those to happen. But for obvious balance issues, going a year, 2 years, 3 years causes a lot of stagnation in the meta and can cause a lot of frustration with people.
So, in my opinion, an important part of being a member of the CSM is being able to explain gameplay patterns or uses of mechanics that feel broken to CCP in order to explain why you think that there's something that's not healthy for the game. Can you describe something that you have experience with that you perceive to be broken, or at the least overpowered, and explain why it is overpowered or broken in your view?
So with carriers being a good example of a previous inconsistency or out of balance area. Originally, before the most recent nerfs were put out, you would have basically roaming space with, 5, 10 guys. You find a fight with subcaps, and then they would sign on a carrier or warp in a carrier. And the issue with carriers is that if you had anything larger than an assault frigate, they could track you pretty much perfectly. They also had their own EWAR fighters, so they could point and web you. And if you didn't have a micro jump drive, you were pretty much stuck there, and you would just get alpha. So the imbalances I see with the carrier as a whole, from a small gang perspective, is that you basically have a ship that can do everything, that doesn't need any kind of subcap support. So again, like I mentioned, it has its own EWAR fighters, so they can point and web you. So it doesn't need a separate, rapier, a Hugin, to actually hold you down. It can do it all itself. So it kind of takes that element of having a composition to fight someone without and just puts it all in that single ship. Which, from my perspective, going through like battleships and things like that, you expect battleships to have support, or you expect to sacrifice a lot to get a battleship to apply to smaller targets. Whereas a carrier, in the past you had the NSA that had no real drawbacks except for cap usage. You have carriers that can link themselves, so they technically have high slot tanks. They have high slot damage and speed mods. So that means they can fill their mids up with application and or tank, and their lows with damage, assuming it's like a Nidhogger or a Thanatos. So again, there's no real fitting interaction happening there. It's just a one ship that does all. After the changes, where they actually nerfed application, they improved a lot of things, at least just from what I've seen so far. As in, they aren't the answer to every single frigate that roams in your space now, because they aren't going to apply very well. So either they have to add more fitting, or they need actual subcap support. And so now that has kind of opened things up. Like, for example, just the other day, I had tackled a carrier in my Nightmare. So I was able to hold him fairly easily with my Nightmare and tank his fighters because I had the afterburner bonus. He couldn't apply very well. They warped in a second carrier. And again, I was able to tank two carriers with my Nightmare in those conditions, whereas before, they would have just alpha through me and I would have been forced to warp off. So just with that change, I was able to see a drastic improvement in interactions and future interactions, or other interactions I've seen with when I'm flying in a small gang. I've also seen that we're able to remain on field longer and actually fight the other subcaps on field, or fight the carrier and continue fighting instead of running away, which it just improves everyone's interactions because we can fight longer.
So the CSM has to give input on many things, even on things that are normally thought of as coming under the CSM's purview, such as UI design. In fact, a meeting with the UI team, Team Psychosisters, is a part of most summits. As such, can you describe a part of the UI that you interact with heavily and identify a problem with it when used in the way that you operate it?
I think two off the bat that I can think of is probe scanning window. Since I live in a wormhole, I'm pretty much probing all the time, and the map. I guess one area, or one little thing, at least with the probe window, that I've noticed, and this could even be my own fault, but I'm not sure, is when you load up the probe window and you drop probes, your probes aren't centered on you anymore. They used to center on the ship where you were. Now they like appear like 30 AU away. And you have to move them, and this is helpful, or it's good to have them appear on top of your ship location in a case where you're jumping out of a wormhole into another wormhole and you want to instantly bookmark the hole that you're on, because you can just drop probes and hit scan. But now I have to drop probes, move the probe thing around to my icon, and then hit scan to find the hole that I'm sitting on. So it's a little thing, but it's still part of the UI. And I still think the whole probing mechanic is a little bit clunky. It has been improved, but it's still slightly clunky. As far as the other mechanic, which is the map, um, going from a wormhole perspective, sometimes we have a location, but it I have to like type in each system manually when I'm inside the wormhole to kind of map out a path. It would be nice to be able to have some way to map a path from inside the wormhole by maybe just clicking a system and immediately kind of like dragging a pathway, like almost like in GPS, where you could kind of set your own path just by clicking things, just to kind of look at a route very easily without having to type in each system name to mark a path from inside the wormhole anyway, because the tracking doesn't work inside a wormhole. So it'd be nice, just quality of life changes there to see those, because it's when you're doing that all day every day, even those very minor things kind of add up over time.
So, monetization is often a dirty word within the player base. However, as you're running for the CSM, I hope you understand that it's a necessary part of CCP continuing to exist, while still something to be safeguarded against becoming too rampant. What is a new area of monetization that CCP could undertake which you would argue against? And what would your argument be to convince CCP on why it shouldn't be done?
I think the main ones, or at least the ones that would first come to mind, is anything that would affect direct stats or balances. So, a previous example would be like golden ammo or, golden modules, just as a cliche name, as those would directly affect damage or like armor or resistance values for the price of real life money, which would completely throw off the balance of the game. So basically, why it would affect them personally. Sorry, another cop car. Why it would affect them personally is that you're gonna distance yourself from a lot of the player base by doing something like that. Especially if that were to happen, a lot of people would probably just quit because they don't want to be involved in a game that's balanced around real life money. Um, they want to just play with the tools that are within the game. And most people, including myself, are fine with things like, skins and even injectors for the most part. I mean, there's some balance issues there, but that's not the topic here. Um, but those, I believe, don't really have any issues. I think they're well balanced and they're good for the game. But adding anything that affects direct stats is just going to completely throw off the balance of the game and will just push people away from it.
So, Stitch, if you were elected, how would you differentiate yourself from the other members of the council?
Well, assuming most of the CSM is going to be filled up with no block members, I think the biggest things that would differentiate me from the rest of them is that I'm going to be looking at everything from small gang perspective, wormhole, low sec. And also, in general, I'd also don't want to be limiting myself by looking at the game through those factors. I want to look at everything from a whole game view. So if this one thing changes, not only will I be thinking how's it going to affect, low sec or null sec or this one chip, I would rather be looking at it as how is it going to affect the entire game? What are ways that it could be broken? In this particular section of space, how it, for example, how could it affect faction warfare with people sitting in plexes trying to get LP, and or find outliers where the ship is just really strong and fitting. So that's kind of what I would be bringing is just more experience from other parts of space rather than just nullsec and how it would affect that, and also allowing small gang a little bit of a foothold back into the meta to just help there be more skirmishes and Eve, more fights. The game is too peaceful right now. I would like to see a lot more fights just all over.
Okay, thank you. So, for my final directed question, what other non incumbent candidate would you most like to see elected, either alongside yourself or in place of yourself?
So the one that I can think of off the top of my head would be Teddy, because I believe he's the other wormhole representative and small gang kind of guy. Um, some of the other options, I believe, were not able to make it onto the CSM. So Teddy is one. Matthew Dust is another one, as he's focused primarily on faction warfare. So it'd be nice to have, even if I didn't make it in, at least someone on there that would be low sec or faction warfare, just so we can, if it is ends up being on CCP's roadmap, they can provide good information to help them with rebalancing or iterating on it. And other than that, Steve is always a good choice, and not necessarily for small gang or anything like that, but he's just a solid, candidate for just all over. Um, Other than that, not that everyone else is bad, but for my particular play style or my perspective, I think those are the better candidates for this area of discussion.
Alright, well, with all of that, I'll just give you a couple of moments to make any final remarks you would like to make, and any shout outs, etc. Just put a full stop on why you think people should vote.
So I'd like to have, the reason why I'm running or why I'd like people to vote is so there can be more experience and perspective within the CSM, just so that it's not overly focused on a particular section of space. As I've lived in multiple areas of space, I have a good perspective on those areas. And I just want to see more conflict in Eve, less safety, kind of bring it back to its roots. Even if that means that the small guy might poke you a few times, at least we'll get a fight out of it instead of everyone being docked up. And I think it just adds a lot more to the game when everyone is interacting and not hiding or AFK, in a PvP game. So I would like to see more of those kind of interactions and push for more interesting mechanics or rebalances to help utilize those mechanics more instead of kind of pushing them aside for more safety.